The old Ford rattled as we wound our way deeper into the Bitterroot National Forest, the kind of winding, shoulderless mountain roads where guardrails were either optional or forgotten entirely. I was in the passenger seat, staring out at endless slopes of pine and fir, trying to ignore the way the truck shuddered every time we hit a pothole. My best friend Mark had both hands on the wheel, humming along to some classic rock station that crackled in and out as the mountains swallowed our signal. We'd planned the trip for months, a late summer 4-day camping trip to a remote spot he'd heard about from a coworker. Totally secluded, he had told me. Quiet, no tourists, no RVs playing loud music. Just the woods, man. At the time, it sounded perfect. We both needed a break from work, from life, from everything. But as the road narrowed and the trees seemed to lean closer, I had to admit a small part of me wondered if we were heading somewhere people didn't go for a reason. Almost there, Mark said with the confidence of a man who had no GPS and only a printed map folded on the dashboard. How do you know? I asked. He grinned. Because the guy told me to watch for a rusted sign with a bullet hole in it. Can't miss it. That's reassuring, I muttered. Sure enough, a few minutes later, we passed a bent road sign peppered with rust and punctured by what looked like a .30-06 round. There it is, Mark whooped. Trailhead's about a mile down this spur road. The spur road was more like a suggestion of a path, rutted dirt, patches of gravel, and deep grooves carved by rainwater. The suspension groaned with every bounce. 10 minutes later, we rolled into a clearing just wide enough for the truck. Past that, a narrow hiking trail cut into the forest. This is it, Mark said, killing the engine. I stepped out, the smell of pine pitch and damp soil thick in the air. No highway noise, no distant engines, just wind whispering through treetops and the occasional croak of a raven. Our plan was simple. Hike 2 miles in, set up camp near a creek Mark's coworker had mentioned, fish, relax, drink too much, talk about life, maybe pretend we were young again. But nature had its own plans. We packed up quickly. Tents, coolers, food, bear canisters, the little camping stove, and the cheap walkie-talkies Mark insisted we bring, just in case. The trail was narrow but well-defined, weaving through thick undergrowth and tall pines with trunks like cathedral columns. Light filtered through in thin gold beams. This is perfect, Mark said for the 10th time. Dude, this is gonna be great. I nodded, trying to shake the vague unease that had been growing since we left the truck. Maybe it was the silence. Even in forests, there's usually something, birds, bugs, something. But here, the quiet felt heavy, almost watchful. Hey, I said at one point, you ever feel like we're being stared at? Mark laughed. By what? Squirrels? Relax. You're just not used to being this far from civilization. He wasn't wrong. I grew up in Phoenix. The closest I came to wilderness was a city park with 3 mesquite trees and a trash can full of beer bottles. But still, about an hour into the hike, we found the creek, a clear, cold ribbon of water moving fast over polished stones. We chose a flat patch near a cluster of boulders and began setting up camp. By the time the tents were up, the sun was dipping low, painting everything in warm orange light. Mark cracked open 2 beers and tossed one to me. To the best camping trip of our lives, he said. At least top 3, I joked. We clinked cans and took long, cold sips. That first night wasn't scary. Not really. Just unsettling. As darkness settled, the forest seemed to change. Every rustle felt louder, the shadows deeper. We sat by the fire, cooking hot dogs and drinking beer, talking about old times. But every so often, I'd catch Mark glancing out into the dark like he heard something. You good? I asked. Yeah, he said quickly. Just thought I heard branches breaking. Probably nothing. But it didn't sound like nothing. Around midnight, we crawled into our tents. I was drifting off when I heard it. Steps. Slow. Deliberate. Maybe 20 feet away. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped, replaced by a faint, measured breathing. Mark? I whispered. No answer. The breathing moved, crunching softly through underbrush, circling our campsite. I reached for the small flashlight beside me, flicked it on, and pointed it toward the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed white, but I saw no silhouette, no figure, just the sound of something walking right past me. When the noise finally faded, I exhaled shakily. Probably an animal, I told myself, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But raccoons don't walk in slow, steady footsteps like a person. Eventually, I fell asleep. Morning came with bright sun and the smell of coffee. Mark was already up, boiling water on the little stove. "You sleep okay?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "Heard something walking around last night." He paused. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I heard it too." "What do you think it was?" "Honestly, might have been an elk. They're huge. Sound almost like people walking." I nodded, though neither of us seemed convinced. We spent the morning fishing along the creek. The water was ice cold, and trout flashed in the current like silver coins. Mark was having a blast, whooping every time he pulled one in. For a while, I forgot my nerves. Around noon, I wandered farther upstream while Mark stayed behind to clean the fish. The creek curved around a fallen tree, its roots twisted like giant claws. Beyond that was a narrow stretch of bank where moss covered the rocks like thick green carpet. I'd taken maybe 10 steps when I noticed footprints. Human footprints, bare footprints. The ground was damp, soft enough to hold impressions. I crouched down. The prints were fresh, edges sharp, water still pooled in the heel of one. They were long, maybe size 12 or 13, and deep, like whoever made them was either very heavy or stepping with force. "Mark," I called out. Nothing. A cold breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves. I straightened up, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The forest felt different, tense somehow, as if it were holding its breath. I followed the prints a few feet before they vanished on a patch of rocky ground. They led nowhere. No campsite, no trail, nothing. Just the woods. When I got back, Mark was gutting the fish. "Found something weird," I said. He looked up. "What?" "Bare footprints. Big ones. Fresh." His knife froze. "Where?" "Just upstream." He swallowed hard. "You sure they were human?" "Positive." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he forced a laugh. "Probably some hippie camping nearby. Maybe he likes walking around barefoot." I didn't respond because I knew he didn't believe that any more than I did. After lunch, we decided to explore further along the creek, hoping to find signs of another campsite. We walked nearly a mile and found nothing. No tents, no gear, no people, no trails leading in or out, no reason for someone to be out there without shoes. Back at camp, the mood had changed. Mark kept glancing toward the trees, and I kept checking the walkie-talkies to make sure the batteries were good. We stuck close to camp the rest of the day and tried to pretend everything was normal. That night, the woods were louder, cracking branches, distant snapping sounds, the occasional thump like something heavy hitting the ground. We didn't talk much. We just sat by the fire, listening. Then, around 11 p.m., we heard it. A long, low whistle coming from somewhere up the ridge. Not melodic, not like a person trying to get attention, more like someone forcing air through clenched teeth. Mark and I froze. The whistle came again. Then again, closer this time. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know how to. We extinguished the fire and went to our tents early, hoping the dark would hide us. But hiding didn't matter. Around 2 a.m., I woke to voices. 2 of them. Whispering. My heart kicked hard. I strained to hear. The whispers were muffled but close, maybe 30 feet away. I unzipped my sleeping bag quietly, pressing my ear to the ground like I thought I'd hear better. The whispers were low, rhythmic, not English, not a language I recognized. There was a strange cadence to it, like chanting or reciting something. Then a laugh. High-pitched. Wrong. Like someone trying to imitate laughter without understanding what it was supposed to sound like. I felt my stomach clench. "Mark?" I hissed. "Yeah," he whispered shakily from his tent. "I hear them." "What do we do?" He didn't answer. Footsteps followed, approaching, slow. I grabbed my flashlight, thumb trembling on the switch, waiting for a silhouette to appear. The footsteps stopped just outside our camp. Silence. Thick, total silence. Then, a hand dragged across the side of my tent. I jerked back, my breath catching. The fabric bowed inward slightly as fingers traced along it, slow, deliberate, like someone feeling the outline of my body from the other side. "Get out," a voice whispered. A man's voice, low, harsh, right beside my ear. I scrambled backward, nearly knocking over my gear. "Mark!" I hissed. But Mark was already unzipping his tent, flashlight in hand. He burst out, shining the beam wildly. "Hey! Back off!" I unzipped mine and stumbled out. Nothing. No people. No movement. Just darkness and trees. "Where the hell did they go?" I whispered. Mark was shaking. "I don't know. They were right here." I heard them. We stood back to back, flashlights sweeping the forest. Nothing made sense. If someone had been touching my tent seconds earlier, they wouldn't have had time to disappear without sound. We're leaving tomorrow, Mark whispered. I nodded quickly. At first light. Neither of us slept after that. We sat by the dead fire pit, flashlights in our hands, jumpy at every sound. And the sounds didn't stop, a whistle now and then, branches snapping, something splashing in the creek. Once, around dawn, we heard footsteps running, full sprint, past our camp. But when we shined our lights, there was nothing there. As soon as the sky turned pale, we tore down camp in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the tent poles twice. Mark splashed cold creek water on his face, looking pale and sleep-deprived. We started back on the trail, hiking fast, too fast. The packs dug into our shoulders, but we didn't slow down. After 20 minutes, Mark stopped suddenly. "What's wrong?" I asked. He pointed at the ground. Footprints. Bare footprints. Leading down the trail ahead of us. Fresh ones. "Someone's following the same path," he whispered. "Or leading us somewhere," I said before I could stop myself. We picked up the pace. For the next half-mile, we saw the prints every few yards, sometimes on the trail, sometimes veering off into the brush before returning again. Once we found several, like someone had stood there for a long time, watching, waiting. At one point, Mark turned around abruptly. "Did you hear that?" I listened. A faint clicking sound echoed from deeper in the trees. Not branches, not rocks, more like teeth clicking together. "Keep moving," I said, but the sound followed, closer each time. Finally, with the truck just a few minutes away, the forest went dead silent again. So silent I could hear my heartbeat. We rounded the last bend and froze. Someone was standing beside our truck, a tall, broad-shouldered man, shirtless, filthy, skin gray with dirt, hair matted and wild, and his bare feet were black with soil. He stared at us with wide, glassy eyes, unmoving. Mark whispered, "Holy shit." The man didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched. "Sir," I said, voice cracking, "we don't want any trouble." No response. I slowly pulled out the bear spray from my pack, praying he didn't take it as a threat. Then he took one step toward us. His foot landed with a soft thud. Mark raised his hands. "Stay back, please." The man cocked his head, like he didn't understand the words, or maybe he did and didn't care. He took another step, then another. Something moved behind him. At first I thought it was just a shadow shifting, but then I saw another figure, shorter, thin, also barefoot, also filthy. A woman, or what used to be a woman. Her face was smeared with something dark. Her eyes were sunken, hollow. They both started walking toward us. "Run," I whispered. Mark didn't hesitate. We bolted into the trees beside the trail, trampling bushes, not caring where we stepped. Branches whipped my face, my lungs burned. Behind us, I heard the soft, steady footfalls of the barefoot pair following. Not running, not rushing, just stalking us. Mark veered right, and I followed. The forest was thicker here, harder to navigate. I tripped over a log, caught myself, kept going. We ran until we couldn't hear them anymore, until my legs shook, until nausea clawed at my throat. Finally, we collapsed behind a fallen cedar, gasping for air. "What the hell were they?" Mark whispered. "I don't know," I said, "but they weren't campers." Mark peeked over the log. "We need to get back to the truck. They're between us and the truck." "So we wait until they move? And if they don't?" He didn't answer. Minutes passed, then far away we heard it again. That whistle. Long, low, searching. "We can't stay here," Mark whispered. "We need another way out." "There is no other way," I said. "The road's the only access." He sat back, rubbing his face. "We're screwed." "No," I said. "We still have the walkie-talkies. Maybe we're close enough to get a signal near the ridge. There's a chance." It was a slim chance, but it was something. We moved quietly through the forest, uphill toward a break in the trees where sunlight glowed through. Every few seconds I checked behind us. Every snapped twig made my skin crawl. When we reached the ridge, Mark pulled out his walkie and clicked the button. "Hello? Hello? Anyone copy? This is an emergency." Static. He tried again. "Copy, please. We're in Bitterroot National Forest. We're being followed by 2 individuals. Please respond." More static. Then a crackle. Faint, but real. "Copy. Say again." Mark nearly sobbed. "We need help. We're being stalked by 2 people, barefoot, maybe living out here. We're stranded. Our truck is blocked. They're dangerous." The voice cut in again. "Stay put. Heading your way. 20 minutes. "Did you hear that?" I grabbed his shoulder. "They're coming." "That's if it wasn't interference," Mark said, panic creeping in. "What if we didn't really—" A sound snapped through the forest. A branch. Close. Too close. We ducked behind a cluster of boulders just as footsteps approached. Slow, careful. Mark's breathing grew so fast I had to put my hand on his chest, motioning for silence. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the boulders. I could hear breathing. Heavy. Then, a whisper. Found you. My jaw tightened. Mark covered his mouth with both hands, stifling a cry. The whisper came again, but this time from farther away. Found you. Not one voice. Two. Echoing through the trees. They were searching, calling to each other. We stayed frozen, not daring to breathe. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps faded. Mark leaned close. We need to move. Where? Anywhere but here. We slipped deeper into the forest, trying to stay hidden, moving slow but steady. Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. When we finally saw the flashing lights of a ranger truck through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. 2 rangers jogged toward us, both armed. Are you the ones who called for help? Yes, Mark shouted. They're here somewhere, 2 people, following us. Who? One ranger asked. We don't know, I said, but they were waiting by our truck, watching us. The rangers exchanged looks. Show us, the older one said. We led them back down the ridge toward the spur road. I kept expecting to see the barefoot pair step out from behind a tree, but we saw no one. When we reached the truck, the area was empty. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone. But something was wrong. The driver's side door of Mark's truck was wide open. I closed that, Mark whispered. I'm sure I closed that. Inside, the upholstery was torn. Deep claw-like rips streaked across the seats. The glove box hung open, papers scattered. Worst of all, there on the dashboard was a rock. Not just any rock, a smooth river stone. On it, drawn in something brownish red, was a symbol, a circle, with a line down the middle, the same shape the footprints had formed where they stopped earlier. A marker, a sign, a warning. The rangers looked at it and stiffened. All right, the older one said carefully, we're getting you boys out of here. Now. We didn't argue. We didn't look back. We drove out with the ranger truck leading us, Mark's Ford rattling behind. I watched the trees as we left, half expecting to see 2 figures standing at the edge of the road. I didn't. But as we turned the final corner, I heard it again. A whistle. Long, low, low, following us. We didn't speak the rest of the ride home. We didn't go camping again. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is still, I swear I can hear that same whistle outside my window. It always stops the second I turn on the lights, like whoever it is already knows they've been found. Story. The end. The forest smelled like wet earth and pine needles, but underneath it there was something sour, almost like decay that hadn't yet fully happened. I noticed it the moment we parked at the trailhead. My brother Luke and I had driven 3 hours north to a small, relatively unknown camping spot near Devil's Creek in Oregon. It was late August, the kind of warm that makes your shirt stick to your back, but the forest air hit us cold and damp. We had planned this weekend for months, something simple. 2 nights, fishing, maybe a short hike, and a small campfire. Nothing elaborate. Luke had been camping plenty of times, and I was familiar with outdoor survival basics, so we didn't feel the need to overpack. Just the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, fishing gear, and a small first aid kit. The first mile of the trail was normal enough. Birds called overhead, the creek gurgled in the distance, and sunlight pierced the treetops in bright, scattered beams. But after about half an hour, I realized something strange. The usual chorus of forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, squirrels running along branches, birds calling repeatedly, was missing. It wasn't quiet like peaceful quiet. It was quiet in a way that felt conscious, deliberate, like the forest itself was listening. Do you hear that? I asked Luke. Hear what? He replied, scanning the path ahead. Nothing, just silence. He shrugged. You're imagining things. Relax, it's a forest. That's kind of the point. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the silence pressed at the back of my mind as we set up our campsite near a wide bend in the creek. The ground was slightly uneven, but dry enough to pitch our tents. As Luke hammered stakes into the earth, I scanned the surrounding trees. There was a faint shimmer, like a heat haze, though the air was cool. It made me uneasy. We got the fire going before dusk. The flames danced and crackled, and the smell of burning wood was comforting, normal. I kept hearing little things, twigs snapping in the distance, the occasional soft rustle of leaves. I assumed it was wildlife. That night, I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. A whisper, so soft I almost didn't hear it. It wasn't English, not any language I knew, just a hissing, elongated murmur. My first thought was Luke sleep-talking, but the sound wasn't coming from his tent. It was outside, circling the campsite. I held my breath, listening. The whispering faded, then returned from another direction. Step by step, it seemed to move closer, always just at the edge of the trees. My pulse was pounding. I debated waking Luke, but didn't want to risk shouting or moving and attracting whatever it was. Eventually it stopped, or I convinced myself it had. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the outline of the forest beyond the firelight. Morning brought no relief. The forest seemed changed. The creek flowed as normal, the birds had returned, but everything felt sharper, more deliberate. The shadows were longer, darker than they should have been for the sun's position. When I mentioned my unease, Luke laughed it off. "Man, you really need to stop watching those horror movies before camping," he said, tossing a small branch into the fire. We spent the day fishing. The creek was beautiful, crystal clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every so often, I would catch movement between the trees, but whenever I focused, nothing was there. The feeling intensified near the lake, a small body of water about 15 minutes hike from our camp. The sun was low when we returned. The fire had died down to glowing embers. As we cooked dinner, I noticed a shadow moving near the tree line. Not human, not animal, just a dark shape, tall, almost elongated, moving slowly between the pines. I froze, unsure if I should speak. Luke didn't notice. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it came. Later that night, the forest erupted with noise. Low groans, rustling, and soft thumps surrounded our campsite. I shook Luke awake. "Something's out there," I whispered urgently. He rubbed his eyes. "It's the wind. Go back to sleep." But I knew it wasn't the wind. I could hear breathing, soft, deliberate, moving between the trees. Something was circling us. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on something I will never forget. A figure standing far beyond normal human height, too thin, limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally. It didn't move like a human, but it watched, and it had eyes, yellow, glowing faintly in the darkness. I yelped. Luke sat up, flashlight in hand. "What is it?" The figure vanished. We packed our tents immediately. No sleep, no fire, just gear stuffed into packs, and we started down the trail toward the truck. Every snapped twig and rustle made us jump. At one point, I tripped and hit the dirt. When I looked up, there were more shadows, shapes moving between trees, not running, not walking, just sliding along, keeping pace. We didn't stop until the trail opened into the parking area. The truck had been parked in sunlight when we left, but now it felt strange, out of place, almost too small against the towering trees. We jumped in, locked the doors, and drove straight back. Neither of us spoke until the highway stretched open in front of us. That weekend, something followed us. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it in my dreams. Tall shadows in the corners of my vision, whispering voices calling from dark places. I haven't gone camping alone since. The forest at Devil's Creek isn't on any official maps anymore, and locals avoid it. There are rumors of people disappearing, hikers who never returned, campers who came back screaming about things that didn't belong in this world. I don't know what we saw exactly, but I know one thing. Some forests are alive in ways we can't understand. Some things wait patiently for us to enter, and when we do, they remember. I'll never forget the yellow eyes, the elongated shape, the soft, circling sound at night. I'll never forget the suffocating stillness, the way the forest itself seemed to bend around us, and I'll never go back. Story the end. The air in northern Arizona always feels different at night, thinner somehow, as if sound doesn't travel the same way. Maybe that's why I didn't hear the man until he was already too close, or maybe I just didn't want to believe what I was hearing. I hadn't planned on camping alone that weekend, but everyone else had bailed. My brother caught the flu, my friend Danielle was stuck with a double shift, and Mike, who was usually the reliable one, had some anniversary thing with his girlfriend. I'd already taken the time off work, packed, loaded the truck, bought firewood. I wasn't about to scrap the trip just because I'd be solo. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. I wasn't inexperienced. I grew up in the desert, hunting jackrabbits with my dad, learning how to read the sky and check the wind. I knew where to camp, where not to camp, what noises to ignore, what noises to pay attention to. I knew how to keep myself safe. At least I thought I did. The spot I chose was about 30 minutes south of Flagstaff, far enough from the main roads to avoid tourist noise, close enough to hike back if the truck broke down. Tall ponderosa pines, thick undergrowth, no other campers in sight. It was perfect. I pitched my tent, walked a half-mile loop around the area, gathered some kindling, set up the fire ring. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I even remember thinking, as the sun dipped behind the trees, that it was the kind of evening that made solo camping worth it. Quiet, crisp, and completely mine. The first strange thing happened around dusk. I was sitting on a folding chair by the fire, heating a can of chili, when something flashed between the trees ahead of me. Movement. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or an elk. They're everywhere in the area, but it wasn't shaped like an animal. It was upright, tall and upright, a person. A man, I guessed from the build, wearing something light-colored, maybe tan or gray. I couldn't see his face. He was too far away and already slipping behind the tree trunks. What bothered me wasn't that he was there. Hikers and dispersed campers cross paths all the time. What bothered me was that he didn't say anything. You always call out in the woods. It's an unspoken rule. If you don't want to get shot or mistaken for a threat, you make your presence known. A simple hello goes a long way, but he didn't. He just walked by, quiet, slipping out of view like he'd been watching me. I stood up, called out, "Hey, you okay out there?" No answer. The forest swallowed him. I listened. The wind rattled pine needles. The fire popped. Somewhere off to the left, a bird gave a warning screech and took flight, but no footsteps, no brush moving, nothing human. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he didn't want small talk. Maybe he was just passing through, minding his own business. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up long after he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't fear, at least not at first. It was the noises. The forest at night is never silent, but there's a rhythm to it. Crickets chirp, owls hoot, the occasional rustle hints at a rabbit or raccoon. You learn which sounds belong and which don't. Around midnight, I heard something that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside my tent. I sat up instantly, heart slamming against my ribs. The footsteps weren't heavy, but they weren't the skittering of an animal either. They had weight, intention. Someone was walking around my camp. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction. They circled behind the tent, then paused, right behind my head. I could hear their breathing. Not loud, not wheezing, just breathing. Human breathing. I reached for the flashlight and my knife. I didn't unzip the tent. I wasn't stupid. If someone wanted to mess with me, opening the tent would just make me vulnerable. Instead, I yelled, "I'm armed. You need to leave." Silence. Then, without a sound of retreat, the breathing stopped. No footsteps walking away, no branches snapping. It was like the person had vanished. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, jumping at every twig snap. When the first light came, I rushed out of the tent, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them, footprints. Human footprints circling the tent. The dirt was soft enough that the impressions were clear. Shoe prints, size maybe 11 or 12, deep enough to belong to a grown man. They went around the tent twice. Then they stopped, literally stopped. The last prints were about 10 feet behind the tent, pointed toward it, and then nothing. No trail leading away, no drag marks, no other steps. It was like the man just lifted off the ground and disappeared. I told myself there must be an explanation. The soil was patchy. Maybe he stepped on rocks or pine needles. Maybe I just missed the continuation of the trail. I wasn't ready to accept anything else. I made coffee, trying to calm down. Love of nature or not, I don't mess with people creeping around my campsite. I decided I'd stay one more night, but keep my hatchet on me. If anything else happened, I'd pack up and go. For most of the day, nothing happened. I went on a short hike, cooked lunch, read a book in the shade. By late afternoon, I started to feel silly for getting worked up. If someone had wanted to hurt me, they had all night. When evening came, I started the fire early. The glow made me feel safer somehow. I sat with my back to a thick tree trunk so nothing could sneak up behind me again. The sun set, the temperature dropped, the forest darkened, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't near the tent. They were off in the woods, coming from the same direction where I'd seen the man the night before. Slow steps, unhurried, steady. I shone my flashlight toward the sound. For a moment, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then something moved. A figure, standing between two pines. Tall, thin, wearing something light-colored, watching me. I felt my throat tighten. "Hello?" I called out again, voice shaking despite my attempt to sound confident. The man didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react at all. He just stood there like he was waiting. I stepped back toward my truck, keeping the light trained on him. "Sir, you need to leave. I don't want trouble." Still nothing. Then slowly he tilted his head, not curiously, not confused, more like studying me, like he was trying to decide something. A cold wave passed through me. I grabbed my keys, shoved everything I could into the truck bed, tent poles, water jug, cooler, whatever I could manage. I wasn't folding anything nicely, I was throwing it. My heart was hammering so hard I felt dizzy. Every few seconds I looked up. The man never moved, never stepped closer, never stepped back, just watched. When I finally slammed the truck door shut and turned on the headlights, he was gone. Vanished again. The drive back to town was the longest hour of my life. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see that pale figure sitting up in the truck bed or running alongside the road. I didn't see him again until 3 days later. I was at home, trying to forget the whole thing, telling myself it had to be some weird drifter messing with me. I had just finished dinner when I noticed something on my front porch, a footprint, a single dirt footprint, like someone had stepped there deliberately. I froze. My neighborhood had paved walkways, no loose soil. Someone must have carried the dirt with them, and the footprint looked familiar, same size, same tread as the ones around my tent. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding. On the porch railing leaned an envelope. No name, no return address, just one sheet of paper inside. On it was written in shaky handwriting, "Next time, don't yell." I called the police. They came, they looked around, they took the note. They asked the usual questions, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. No forced entry, no direct threat. Probably a prank, they said. I knew it wasn't a prank. 2 nights later, around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound at my window. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Human. Just like at the campsite. When I ripped the blinds open, no one was there, but the glass had a fresh streak on it, like someone's nose or forehead had pressed against it moments before. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I barely slept for a week. It's been months now. I moved apartments, changed my routine, stopped camping entirely. But sometimes when I wake up in the dark, I hear it again. Breathing. Slow, close, listening, waiting. And I know he's still out there, the man from the woods, the man who never speaks, the man who somehow disappears and appears again without a sound. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I know this. He followed me out of those woods, and he doesn't seem like he's done. Story the end. The gravel popped under the truck tires as we rolled deeper into the Kaibab National Forest, the kind of place where the pines crowd in on both sides like spectators waiting for something to happen. I'd camped plenty of times, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, but northern Arizona had always felt different to me. Older, wilder. My friend Drew joked that it was the kind of place where you could scream your lungs out and nobody would hear it until the trees were done listening. He wasn't wrong. We were heading for a spot he claimed was perfect, flat ground, good tree cover, a narrow stream nearby. He'd camped there once before with his older brothers and remembered it being quiet enough to hear your heartbeat. Quiet like peaceful, he said. Not quiet like creepy. But the deeper we drove, the more the forest felt like it was closing around us, the road narrowing until branches scraped the sides of the truck like fingernails on an old chalkboard. By the time we pulled into the clearing, the sun was sliding behind the treetops. Long shadows spilled across the ground, twisting between the trunks like fingers stretching toward us. The air smelled like sap and cold dirt. In the distance, something let out a single sharp cry. Not a bird. Not anything I could name. I glanced at Drew, but he just killed the engine and hopped out. The sudden silence was heavy. We unloaded the gear and set up camp. The clearing itself was beautiful in a rugged kind of way. Pine needles blanketing the ground, patches of late autumn grass, and a ring of large stones that almost looked arranged, though Drew said they had been there before. Behind it, the ground sloped downward into a tangle of underbrush and deadfall. "See?" Drew said as he hammered in a stake. "Perfect." I forced a grin. Something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't the cold or the quiet. It was the sense that we weren't alone long before night settled in. We built a fire, cooked chili from cans, and drank cheap beer. For a while, it felt normal, laughing, swapping stories, listening to wind sift through the branches. But every now and then, I'd catch Drew glancing toward the trees with this little furrow between his eyebrows, like he was trying to place a sound just out of reach. At some point, I asked, "You sure this is the same spot?" "Positive." But he said it too fast. The forest darkened fast, the fire the only warm thing in a world that had suddenly turned black and cold. Shadows fluttered at the edges of the clearing, moving in ways the trees shouldn't. The wind picked up, but instead of the usual rustling, it sounded like whispers weaving through the branches. At around 10 p.m., we heard the first snap. It came from the darkness beyond the firelight, clean, sharp, deliberate, not the kind of crack a falling branch makes, more like a footstep. We both froze. "Probably an elk," Drew said, but he didn't sound certain. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He just stared into the dark like he was waiting for something to step out. We heard another snap. Then a soft, rhythmic crunching, like leaves being pressed under slow steps. I reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam hit a wall of trees and brush. Nothing moved. Then the light caught something pale, something long. I jerked the flashlight back, but the pale shape was gone. Whatever it was had moved faster than I could track. Drew stood. "Maybe it's a deer." "Deer don't move like that." He didn't answer. We stood there for a long moment, waiting, listening, hearts pounding. The forest settled back into silence. Eventually we sat down again, though neither of us talked much. Even the fire seemed quieter, the crackling subdued, like it didn't want to draw attention. Around midnight, the temperature dropped hard and fast. I threw another log onto the fire and rubbed my arms. The wind shifted, brushing through the clearing, carrying with it the faintest smell of rot. Then we heard it. Not a snap this time. A whistle. Soft, low, echoing between the trees. Almost human. The sound slithered into the clearing, curling around us. It wasn't a tune, just a drawn-out note that dipped at the end. Wrong. Off-key. Like someone who had never heard real music trying to imitate it. Every hair on my body stood up. "Tell me that's not a person," I whispered. Drew's eyes were wide. "Nobody else camps out here." "Then what the hell was that?" We listened, breath held. The whistle came again. Closer. I swung the beam around, but the forest just swallowed it. The sound stopped as the light passed over one of the larger trees that, almost like whatever was making it, ducked back behind the trunk. I backed toward the fire. "Maybe we should get in the tent." "No," Drew muttered. "If something's out there, I'm not crawling into a nylon coffin." He grabbed the hatchet from his bag. That was the moment I realized he was scared. Not unsettled, not cautious, but scared. Drew wasn't the type to spook easily. If anything, he used to tease me for being jumpy. Seeing him gripping the hatchet like it was a lifeline made my stomach twist. The wind gusted again, and another whistle drifted through the dark, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. It moved. It was moving around us. Circling. I felt sick. We stayed awake until nearly 3 a.m., listening, flashlight in hand, waiting for the sound again. But after that last whistle, the forest went dead quiet. Not peaceful, silent in a way that felt suffocating. Eventually, exhaustion dragged us down. We crawled into the tent and zipped it tight. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening for every little sound, every rustle, every breath of wind, every distant crack that could have been a branch or something stepping on one. At some point, I drifted towards sleep, and then I heard something breathing outside the tent. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not animal breathing, not panting, just long inhales and long exhales, like someone standing right outside was listening to us, studying us. I held my breath. I didn't dare move. My chest felt like it was caving in. I waited for Drew to whisper something, but he was silent. Either he was frozen like I was, or he was somehow still asleep. The breathing grew louder, closer. Something brushed against the side of the tent, light, grazing, almost curious. Then a sound came, so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A third whistle. Right beside us. I didn't sleep at all after that. I woke up to sunlight bleeding through the tent. The birds were chirping again. The forest looked normal, alive, almost comforting. But when I crawled out, the comfort vanished in an instant. There were tracks in the dirt. Not paw prints, not boots. Something else. Elongated impressions, almost like footprints but wrong, too narrow at the heel, too long in the front, like stretched human prints. They circled the tent, twice, then trailed off into the woods. Drew stared at them, pale as the dirt beneath his shoes. "Those weren't here yesterday," he said. "I know." He pointed at a spot near one of the deeper impressions. "Look at that." Embedded in the print was a pine needle, broken cleanly in half, like something heavy had stepped on it. We followed the tracks with our eyes until they disappeared into the thickest part of the forest. Both of us took a step back at the same time. "Let's just pack up," I said. "We can get breakfast in town." Drew hesitated. "We're supposed to stay 2 nights. I'm not staying another hour." He looked around the clearing, at the trees, the stones, the spot where we heard the breathing last night, and then nodded. We packed fast, skipping breakfast, and loaded the truck. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, more like it was watching us from the corner of its eye rather than staring us straight in the face. Just as we were about to leave, Drew stopped. "Do you smell that?" I did. The rot smell again. Stronger now. Not like a dead animal, wetter, sour, almost chemical. The kind of smell that clung to the inside of your nose. We climbed into the truck and started down the narrow road. Neither of us talked. Not until we were miles away and the forest thinned out enough for sunlight to pour through. But the feeling didn't lift. Even as the highway approached, I felt like something was still out there in the trees, pacing us, watching us drive away. "Do you think it followed us?" Drew asked suddenly. "No," I said automatically, but I didn't believe it. 3 days later, Drew called me at 2 a.m. I was half asleep and annoyed, but the moment I answered, I froze. His voice wasn't normal. It was shaking. "Did you hear anything when you got home?" "No." "Why?" He swallowed hard. "Something's outside my house." "What do you mean?" "It's in the yard. I heard it walking. The same steps. Slow. Heavy." His voice broke. "It whistled, man." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "You're sure it wasn't someone messing with you?" I looked out the window. His whisper cracked. "It wasn't a person. It was tall, taller than the fence, and its skin." He didn't finish. I heard something in the background, a low whistle drifting through the phone speaker. My heart dropped. "Call the police," I whispered. "They won't believe me." "Just call them." I heard him moving, footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, and then the phone thumped like he set it down. His voice came faintly, saying something I couldn't make out. Then a loud crash, wood splintering, Drew screaming. The phone went dead. I called and went back. No answer. I called again. Nothing. I drove straight to his house. When I pulled up, dawn was just breaking. The front door was cracked open. The frame was splintered like something huge had forced it apart. I ran inside calling his name. His living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, curtains shredded, a deep gouge carved into the floorboards like something dragged its foot or claw or whatever it had across the wood. But Drew wasn't there. Not upstairs. Not outside. Not anywhere. The police searched for weeks. They found no tracks, no signs of forced entry other than the door. Nothing to suggest an animal or a person took him. But I knew. Those tracks around the tent, the breathing, the whistles. It had followed him home. Followed him first. I haven't gone camping since. Hell, I barely sleep. Some nights I'm convinced I hear something outside, the faint crunch of leaves, the whisper of wind that sounds too much like breathing, too slow to be natural. 2 weeks ago, around midnight, I woke up to a sound drifting through my open window. A whistle. Soft. Wrong. Off-key. Just like the forest. Just like that night. I shut the window, pulled the curtains, and sat in the dark, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The whistle came again, closer this time, right beneath the window frame. Long inhale, long exhale. I didn't look. I was too afraid I'd see a long, pale shape standing in the yard, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I still don't know why it followed Drew first instead of me, and I don't know why it came to my house after. Maybe it marked us when it circled the tent. Maybe it learned our scent. Maybe it was curious. Or maybe it was hungry. I'm writing this because I haven't slept in 2 days. Every time I close my eyes, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, careful, curious. My front door is locked. My windows are closed. But that doesn't matter, does it? It didn't matter for Drew. And tonight I heard the whistle again. Inside the house. Downstairs. Coming up the stairs now. Getting closer. I can hear breathing outside my bedroom door. It's long, slow, deliberate. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. but I know what it sounds like when it's right outside your door, waiting to see if you make a noise. And I know that when the breathing stops, that's when the door will open. The breathing just stopped. Story the end. The forest was dense that weekend in late October, the kind where the trees crowd in close and the sunlight barely touches the forest floor. John and his two friends, Mark and Lisa, had driven 4 hours from their small town in Ohio to a state park that promised isolation and a reprieve from the city's constant buzz. They were all experienced campers, or so they liked to believe. They had tents, sleeping bags, lanterns, and a cooler full of food. The three of them were used to hiking and roughing it, but this trip would prove that experience can sometimes be a poor substitute for caution. They arrived around mid-afternoon and parked near the trailhead. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled of wet leaves and pine. They hiked a few miles in, laughing and joking as the path became narrower and more overgrown. By the time they found a clearing that seemed suitable for camping, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long, wavering shadows between the trunks. The clearing was small but flat, and they set up 2 tents, one for John and Mark, the other for Lisa. The first night was uneventful, or so they thought. They cooked hot over a small campfire and shared a couple of beers. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snapping of twigs. Around 11 p.m., as the fire burned low, they all felt a strange stillness settle over the forest. It was as though everything had stopped moving at once. John was the first to hear it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Mark replied, laughing. "It sounded like someone talking. Out there." He gestured vaguely into the shadows beyond the firelight. Lisa frowned. "It's probably just the wind moving through the trees, or an animal." But the whispering continued, soft and intermittent, like voices carried from far away. It wasn't clear words, just murmurs that seemed to drift closer and then recede. They shrugged it off, telling themselves they were just on edge. Eventually, they crawled into their tents and tried to sleep, though none of them slept well. Around 2 a.m., John woke to the sound of snapping twigs outside his tent. He froze, straining to hear over his own heartbeat. The noises didn't seem random. They were deliberate, slow, careful. Something was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. He shook Mark awake. "Mark, I think someone's out there," he whispered. Mark groaned. "Don't be ridiculous. We're in the middle of nowhere. No one's out here." "Then what's that noise?" John hissed. They listened. The snapping of twigs was steady now, circling the tents. Something or someone was moving around them. John's gut twisted. He'd hiked alone before, and he knew that bears and other wildlife made noises, but this sounded different. There was a rhythm to it, a patience. The sound stopped, then resumed a few seconds later, closer this time. Lisa woke at the commotion and peeked outside. Her face went pale. "I don't see anything," she said, voice trembling. But the movement in the shadows told a different story. Whatever it was watching them. They decided to stay put and wait for dawn. Every noise outside felt magnified. At one point, John thought he saw a shadow dart past the trees, tall, thin, and impossibly fast. The next morning, the three of them tried to rationalize the night's events over breakfast. Maybe it had been a deer or a coyote, maybe someone had been hiking nearby. The rationalizations didn't help them shake the uneasy feeling that lingered like fog in their minds. They hiked further along the trail, hoping to clear their heads. By midday, they reached a small river and decided to rest. The sunlight was warm, and the forest seemed more forgiving. But as they sat on the rocks, Lisa pointed toward the trees across the river. "Look, there," she said, voice tight. John squinted. There, on the other side, partially obscured by branches, was a figure. Not a person, not exactly. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, thin, hunched. It didn't move much, just stood there, watching. When they blinked or turned their heads, it seemed to vanish. But when they looked again, it was back, closer to the riverbank. They decided to leave the area immediately. On the way back to their campsite, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every rustle, every broken branch seemed to follow them. The forest, which had been so inviting during the day, now felt hostile. When they returned, one of their tents had been disturbed. Lisa's sleeping bag was pulled out, the tent flap partially open. Nothing else seemed missing, but the sense of intrusion was undeniable. No one had been hiking nearby, at least not according to the faint tracks they could see in the soft mud, which were strange, long, uneven, and not entirely human. They debated leaving immediately, but the sun was low and they didn't want to hike back in darkness, so they stayed, keeping the fire alive and weapons close. They took turns keeping watch. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, though still fragmented. Words like go and leave could be made out if they concentrated. The voices moved with the wind, circling the tents. The snapping of twigs returned, and this time it was accompanied by a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled along the ground. John decided to record the sounds on his phone, thinking maybe it could be explained later. But when they played back the recording, the whispers were gone. Only the forest noise remained. As the night wore on, Mark reported seeing shapes moving just beyond the firelight. They were tall, thin, and unnaturally elongated. Their movements were jerky, like something trying to imitate human motion but failing. They stayed just at the edge of visibility, vanishing whenever a flashlight beam swept over them. By 3 a.m., exhaustion and fear had taken their toll. They huddled in one tent, trying to ignore the sounds outside, but the whispers grew louder, sharper, more urgent, almost like a chorus. And then came the tapping, slow, deliberate, on the sides of the tent. Something was trying to get in. Suddenly there was a loud crash. The tent flap ripped violently. They scrambled out, shining their flashlights into the darkness. Nothing. Only the forest. Only the whispering. It was Mark who first noticed the footprints, large, clawed, and too long to be human. They circled the clearing and then disappeared into the trees. Panic set in. They grabbed their gear and ran. No more hiking, no more waiting. They ran through the darkness, tripping over roots and rocks, driven by pure terror. By the time they reached the parking lot in their car, dawn was breaking. They didn't speak much, just drove back without stopping. Once home, they tried to put the experience behind them, but each heard the whispering whenever they closed their eyes. Weeks later, John returned to the site with his brother, hoping to rationalize what had happened. The clearing was empty. No tracks, no sign of disturbance, nothing. But the uneasy feeling remained. Months after that, Lisa disappeared. She went camping alone in a different state park. Her tent was found ripped open, her belongings scattered. Witnesses reported seeing a figure in the trees, tall and thin, moving unnaturally. John and Mark never saw her again. To this day, when John and Mark speak of that weekend, they avoid certain words. They know the forest is still out there, waiting, watching, whispering. And they know some things are too old and too patient to ever be rationalized. Years later, John stumbled upon a forum where people shared encounters with the Watchers, tall humanoid figures that linger at the edge of the woods, always unseen, always observing. He recognized the description immediately. Others had disappeared, just like Lisa. Others had heard the whispers, the snapping, the dragging. No one knew why. No one knew where they came from. But the consensus was clear. If you saw them, if you heard them, you were never truly safe again. Sometimes late at night, John swears he can hear faint whispers outside his apartment window, even though the nearest forest is miles away. Mark moved to a city far from the woods, but he still dreams of the tall, thin figures circling the campfire, watching, patient, unblinking. And every time someone plans a weekend trip into the deep woods, John tells them the same thing. Be careful, watch the shadows, and never, ever ignore the feeling of being watched. Because if the Watchers are there, they never leave, and they never forget. Story the end. The first strange thing I remember about that trip was the silence on the drive up. Normally, when I went camping with my cousin Mark, we spent half the time arguing about music and the other half making up stupid stories about what would happen if the truck broke down and we had to survive on gas station beef jerky. But that Friday afternoon in late September, neither of us was talking much. The air outside had that early fall crispness, the kind that feels like a warning more than a season, and the sky was an unsettling shade of white-gray, flat and heavy like unpolished metal. We were headed to Whitlow Ridge, a stretch of forest in the northern panhandle of Idaho where Mark had camped once with some coworkers. I had never been there, but he had always described it as peaceful, quiet, and isolated in the best way. A place where the air felt a little cleaner, where the stars looked closer, and where you could hike for miles without seeing another person. That last detail should have been the first red flag. People who disappear like to disappear where no one else goes. But at the time, we were both in our early 20s and isolation felt like freedom, not danger. We had planned to stay for 3 nights, hiking the main ridge trail by day and fishing in a small deep blue lake. Mark's head sat tucked between two long arms of forest. It was supposed to be simple, quiet, a break from work and noise and everything else. By the time the truck rolled into the gravel turnout beside the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low behind the tree line. The clouds overhead had thickened into a pale lid that swallowed the sky's color, leaving everything underneath a shade darker. We got out, stretched, and began unloading gear. I noticed how cold the air was getting, even though it was only late afternoon. The chill wasn't surprising. September in Idaho could be unpredictable, but there was something off about it, a sort of stillness that made the hairs on my arms lift. "Feels colder than last time," Mark muttered as he slung a pack onto his shoulders. "You camped in June, didn't you?" I said. "Kinda different from late September." "Yeah," he said, but he didn't sound satisfied with that answer. We hit the trail with the last of the daylight slipping through the branches, staining the forest floor in broken gold. The ridge path wound upward gently, cutting between thick pines and leaning firs. I noticed early on how the woods didn't sound right. Birds called, sure, but only once each. One chirp, a long pause, another chirp in the distance like it was answering. But nobody kept singing. No repeating patterns, no normal chatter, just single notes spaced far apart, like they were warning each other. The deeper we went, the more the silence began pressing in. Not empty, just listening, like the forest was waiting for something. I could tell Mark felt it too. He kept glancing over his shoulder, then shaking it off like he'd just heard a squirrel or branch falling. "You sure there's a campsite up here?" I asked after about an hour, partly just to break the quiet. "Yeah, more than one. We'll take the first open one we find." But we didn't find any, at least not the way he remembered them. Mark swore there were several small clearings with fire rings and flat ground, spaced in short intervals. But every time the trail widened into what might once have been a campsite, the space was overgrown with waist-high ferns and nettles. The fire pits crumbled or filled with soil as if they hadn't been used in decades. The forest had swallowed everything. We finally found a clearing just as the sun died behind the trees. It wasn't one of the official sites, at least not anymore, but it was flat enough to pitch tents. A few massive old-growth pines circled the spot like silent guards, their branches spread wide overhead, black against the faintly glowing sky. As we set up, that feeling kept needling me, that the woods were too quiet, too old, too aware. We'd been in forests plenty of times. This one felt different, heavier, almost deliberate. I tried to shake it off. New places can feel strange. It didn't mean anything. We got a fire going. The flames crackled bright and orange, a small comfort in the growing darkness. The cold, though, God, it came fast. One moment it was cool, the next it felt like we'd stepped into late November. I pulled on a jacket, then a second layer, and still felt like something icy was pressing against my back. "Didn't bring the winter weather package," I muttered. Mark forced a laugh, but his shoulders were tight. We ate, talked a little, then mostly fell into silence. The darkness around us felt too thick, like the trees leaned closer than before. When the fire died down to glowing coals, I found myself staring into the shadows between the pines, feeling sure, without reason, that something was standing just out of sight. Watching. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Eventually we turned in. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and tried to settle. The cold made it nearly impossible. The air felt wrong inside the tent. Damp, sharp, almost metallic. I tried breathing through my shirt, but it didn't help. I drifted towards sleep, the way you do in pieces when you're too uncomfortable to fully rest. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, soft enough to almost pass for an animal, but too steady, too intentional. I opened my eyes inside the pitch black. The sound came from the tree line behind my tent, footsteps on pine needles. One step, then a long pause, another step. Something was walking around our campsite. I held my breath. My brain tried to rationalize. Maybe Mark got up to pee, maybe an elk was passing through, but no. The steps weren't that heavy, and they weren't far enough away. They circled the clearing, deliberate, dragging slightly at times, as though whoever, or whatever, was pacing around the perimeter. Then the footsteps stopped right behind my tent. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Silence. When the footsteps resumed, they moved away, slow again, retreating toward the dark woods. Eventually, I heard a soft crunch, then nothing. I lay awake for hours. When I finally did fall asleep, it was the restless, light kind of sleep you slip into by accident, like sinking underwater without meaning to. I woke up at dawn to the sound of Mark's zipper opening. I crawled out of my own tent, shivering. He looked pale, with dark bags under his eyes. "You hear anything last night?" he asked quietly. I tried to play it cool. "What kind of anything?" He hesitated. "Footsteps." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Yeah. Thought it was you moving around," he said. "Nope." "Then it was something big," he muttered. "Or someone." We both looked toward the woods. The trees swayed gently in the early morning breeze. Normal. Totally normal. But a deep wrongness hung beneath the surface, like a faint smell of rot you can't locate. We checked around camp. No tracks on the hardened ground. Not surprising, considering how compacted and dry the soil was. But the pine needles behind my tent looked slightly disturbed, like something had brushed them aside. We didn't talk much as we made breakfast. When we finally decided what to do, the plan was simple. Hike to the lake Mark mentioned, spend the day there, and come back before dark. Neither of us wanted to admit we were uneasy about staying near the tents. We left the campsite around 9 a.m. The sun had pushed aside the clouds, but the warmth didn't reach the forest floor. Everything stayed cold, as if the sunlight was being filtered through ice. The trail to the lake started normally. Pine needles, rocks, the occasional fallen log. But the deeper we walked, the stranger things felt. The path narrowed in ways it shouldn't have, forcing us to weave between trees that seemed too close together. At some points, the trail disappeared entirely beneath thick underbrush. Mark swore it had been clear when he came here in June. "I don't get it," he kept saying. "It wasn't like this." We found the lake around noon. It was exactly as he described. Deep blue, perfectly still, like a giant polished stone. Pine-covered hills enclosed it on 3 sides, their reflections sharp enough to look real. The place was beautiful. Too beautiful. So picturesque it felt unreal, like a photograph someone printed and propped up where a real lake should have been. The silence there was wrong. No insects hummed, no water lapped at the shore, no birds called overhead. The world around the lake felt frozen, untouched, waiting. We ate lunch on a boulder near the edge. The forest behind us felt like a wall. At one point, Mark tossed a small pebble into the lake. The splash echoed. I don't mean it was loud, I mean it echoed unnaturally long, bouncing off the trees in a way that made both of us turn our heads sharply. Echoes like that don't happen in thick forest. There's too much soft material, too many uneven surfaces, but this echoed cleanly. Too cleanly. We left shortly after. The hike back felt twice as long. The trail seemed different, longer, narrower, more closed in. I started noticing shapes between the trees that didn't look quite right. Not animals, not people, just shapes. Like shadows where there should be none, their edges too straight or too curved to match the forest. At one point, Mark froze. "You see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze. Between 2 trees about 50 yards off the trail stood a figure. Not moving, not walking, just standing. It was tall. Too tall, at least 7 feet. Its body was narrow, the limbs too long, the torso too thin. The entire figure looked like a shadow that had been peeled off the ground and pinned upright against the world. No details, no face, just a silhouette darker than the surrounding forest. We didn't move. Neither did it. I blinked once, twice. When my eyes focused again, the figure was gone. We rushed back toward camp, barely speaking. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun had dipped behind clouds again, casting everything into that same cold, metallic light. The moment we stepped into the campsite, I felt watched. Not from one direction, from all directions. We built the fire earlier than usual, keeping close to it. I kept catching movement at the edge of my vision, branches swaying without wind, shadows shifting oddly, the faintest suggestion of something stepping behind a tree just as I turned to look. Around sunset, while gathering firewood, I noticed something between 2 roots of a large pine. It was a piece of fabric, dark green, faded, frayed at the edges. I picked it up carefully. It was part of a tent. Mark came over when he saw me crouched. His face paled when he recognized it. That's from the old Forest Service campsite, he said quietly. The one I stayed at in June. It wasn't anywhere near this spot. I swallowed. How far? Half a mile at least. Could have been wind, I offered weakly. He didn't bother responding. We sat by the fire long after dark, neither of us wanting to sleep. The cold intensified until our breath came out in thick white clouds. I added wood every few minutes, but the flame seemed weaker than before, like the forest was draining the heat as fast as we produced it. Around 11 p.m., the noises started again. Not footsteps, not exactly. Something between a shuffle and a drag, as if multiple things were moving in the dark at once, circling the clearing, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always moving, always circling. At one point, Mark hissed, "Look, I did." Two pale shapes glowed faintly between the trees. Eyes, not animal eyes. They weren't the right shape, not reflective, not spaced correctly. They were too far apart, too tall, and they didn't blink. They just watched. More appeared, spread out through the trees, pairs of dull, faintly luminescent eyes staring from the shadows. 10 pairs, then 15, then more than I could count. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt. My throat felt like it was going to close. I remember whispering, "We need to leave." Mark nodded slowly. "Not now. They'll follow." He was right. Running into the forest at night with things like that watching would have been suicide. So we stayed huddled near the fire for hours, our skin freezing, our eyes burning, the sounds circling us relentlessly. Sometime after 3 a.m., the noises stopped. The eyes vanished. The forest fell silent again. We didn't sleep. At dawn, we packed our gear in under 10 minutes, shoving everything into our packs with frantic hands. My fingers were stiff with cold and adrenaline. Every snapped twig made both of us jump. As soon as the fire was out, we bolted down the trail. Not ran. Running felt too risky. But we walked fast enough that we were nearly jogging, our breaths coming sharp and ragged in the icy air. The trail didn't look right. Some turns felt off. Some slopes steeper than before. Several times we reached areas neither of us recognized. It was as if the forest itself was rearranging, twisting the path around us. At one point, we reached a split in the trail that absolutely hadn't been there on the way in. Both branches looked equally worn. No markings, no signs, just trees looming overhead. "Which way?" I asked. Mark stared at both paths, breathing hard. Neither looks familiar. The forest felt tighter. The air felt like it was being squeezed. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. To the left, silence. To the right, a faint sound. Very faint, like something breathing shallowly. Waiting. "We go left," I said immediately. We did. Another hour passed, then another. The trail eventually widened slightly, the trees thinning, the air brightening, and finally we saw the gravel turn out. We didn't breathe until we were inside the truck, doors locked, engine running. Even then, neither of us spoke until we were miles away, like the forest a distant smear in the mirrors. Only then did Mark say, "There was something in those woods." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. We both knew. We never reported anything, never told anyone the details. When people asked how the trip went, we just said it was cold and quiet. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up thinking of those footsteps circling the tent, or those two tall shadows between the trees, or those pale, unblinking eyes watching from the dark. And sometimes I dream of that lake. Perfect. Silent. Waiting. I don't know what lives in that part of Whitlow Ridge. I don't want to know. I only know one thing with absolute certainty. Some places aren't meant for people anymore, and some things in the forest are older than us and far more patient. I haven't been camping since. Story the end. The gravel road narrowed the farther we drove, until it felt less like a road and more like a forgotten path scraped through the trees decades ago. Branches slapped the sides of the truck, pine needles rained across the windshield, and the GPS had long since given up, spinning uselessly in the top corner of the screen. Mark leaned forward in the passenger seat. Squinting through the windshield like that would somehow make the dense forest open up into something friendlier. "This can't be it," he muttered. "No way the campground is this far out." "It's exactly this far out," I said, tapping the printed directions my uncle had given me. He said, "Lost Fork Campground is remote, like genuinely remote." "Remote," Mark said, "not invisible." From the back seat, our friend Tyler laughed. "This is what makes camping cool, man. You want paved roads and gift shops? That's what KOAs are for." I didn't say anything because the truth was I wasn't sure anymore. When Uncle Terry had mentioned Lost Fork, he'd done so carefully, like someone giving instructions for handling live wires. He hadn't forbidden me from going, but he hadn't recommended it either. He'd said in his quiet ranger way, if you go, be careful. Don't push too far past the marked campsites. Don't hike after dark. And if anything feels wrong, really wrong, you leave. I should have listened harder. We finally found the sign. Half-rotten wood, the words Lost Fork Campground burned into it so long ago that the edges had faded into the grain. An arrow pointed down an even narrower road that looked like nature was actively trying to reclaim it. Looks promising, Tyler said, though he sounded less excited now. I turned down the road. The forest swallowed us whole. It took another 10 minutes before the trees thinned enough for us to see the clearing. A wide grass field lay before us, ringed by towering pines so dense they looked like a wall. In the middle sat a pair of abandoned picnic tables, a rusted fire ring, and a faded map sign that had been bleached by years of sunlight. This is not what I expected, Mark said, stepping out of the truck and looking around. Tyler stretched. It's awesome. I wasn't sure. The campground had a strange stillness to it, like the air here was heavier or older or somehow slowed down. Even the breeze felt muted, like it was being swallowed by the trees. But the sun was shining, and we had 3 coolers full of food, 3 tents, 2 rifles for protection, and enough beer to drown a bear if it wandered over. We started unpacking. As we set up camp, Mark kept glancing toward the tree line. Do you guys hear that? He finally asked. Hear what? I said, pounding a tent stake into the ground. Exactly, he said. There's nothing. No birds, no bugs, no wind. It's just quiet. Now that he said it, I realized he was right. The forest was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no insect hum, no bird song. Tyler waved him off. Dude, it's just early in the season. It's late July, Mark said. We didn't talk about it again, but the silence sat with me. Even when we finished setting up and cracked open beers and started cooking dinner, that eerie stillness lingered, settling at the back of my skull like a low-level headache. It wasn't until nightfall that I noticed something else. We were the only ones here. No other tents, no other cars, no signs of recent use at all. Grass grew high around the fire pit. The map on the sign was peeling off the board, and the whole place felt forgotten. Mark looked around the empty campground. Why would nobody come here during peak season? Tyler raised his hands sarcastically. Gee, I don't know. Maybe because it's basically a postcard, people are stupid. But even he didn't sound convinced. We ate, drank, played cards by lantern light, and though we joked and talked and tried to make it feel like any other camping trip, the silence pressed at our little circle of light like something standing just outside of it, waiting. Around midnight, we put out the fire and crawled into our tents. That's when the forest finally made a sound. I had just settled into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a long, high sound drifting through the trees. Not a coyote, not an owl, something more like a whistle, a single rising note. I held my breath. From his tent, Mark whispered, You guys hear that? Probably just wind, Tyler mumbled, but we all knew it wasn't wind. A minute later, it came again, a long, rising whistle that seemed to float between the trees and wrap around the clearing. This time, it was closer. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The moon hung low above the trees, pale and dim, as if the sky itself had lost strength. Mark stepped out too, rifle in hand, the tree line. There, he whispered. It came from over there. Tyler finally stepped out, shivering in his hoodie. Some animal makes that sound, right? He said weakly. It's not around here, I said. We stood listening for nearly 5 minutes, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, we retreated to our tents. I barely slept. In the morning, everything felt normal again. Almost too normal. Birds chirped in the trees, insects buzzed, the woods felt alive in a way they hadn't the day before. That's weird, Mark said as he ate a protein bar beside the cooler. Now suddenly everything wants to make noise? Maybe it was just the weather, Tyler said. Temperature drop or something. But we all knew weather didn't cause forests to go completely silent one day and sing the next. We spent the day fishing at the creek about a half-mile from camp. We caught enough trout for dinner, laughed more than we had the day before, and the tension from the night mostly faded. Until we got back to camp. Our tents had moved. Not far, just rotated slightly, maybe a foot to the left, as if someone had grabbed the corners and dragged them. The coolers, which we had left lined up neatly along the fire pit, were now scattered randomly around the clearing, and the ashes in the fire ring had been disturbed like something had sifted through them with its hands. None of us spoke at first. Then Tyler forced a laugh. Some animal? Probably a bear. A bear rotated our tents? Mark snapped. Bears push stuff around. Do bears drag tents? Mark shouted. Guys, I said, stop. Mark was breathing hard. That wasn't like him. I had known him since high school. He wasn't easily rattled, but he looked genuinely shaken. I walked the perimeter of the camp. No tracks, no claw marks, no paw prints, no disturbed vegetation. The grass wasn't bent or trampled. It was like nothing had walked through at all. But something had been here. We considered packing up, but Tyler talked us out of it with a mix of pride and stubbornness. We're not driving 4 hours home because something bumped a tent, he said. Come on, let's not be wimps. I should have pushed harder to leave. That evening, a fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the trees until we could barely see more than a dozen feet in any direction. The air grew cold, much colder than it should have been in July, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Even the fire seemed quieter, as if the flames themselves were afraid to make noise. We ate quickly, the way people do when they're uncomfortable, and turned in early. I don't know what time it was when the whistling started again. This time it came from multiple directions. Soft, slow, rising and falling like someone attempting a tune they didn't fully know. Mark unzipped his tent. That's it, he hissed. I'm getting the hell out of here. But then the whistling stopped. The forest went dead silent. Then came the footsteps, light, slow, deliberate. Circling the clearing, I froze inside my tent, barely breathing. A shape moved past my tent wall. A shadow, upright, tall, too tall. My heart hammered so loud I thought whoever or whatever it was would hear it. The shadow paused near the corner of my tent. It stood there for several seconds that felt like hours. Then it slowly walked away. I heard Tyler's tent zipper start to open. Tyler, don't, I whispered harshly, but I was too late. His zipper made it halfway before he stopped. A new sound cut through the clearing. A voice. No, not a voice. Not exactly. More like someone trying to remember how to make their mouth shape words. Hello. The word dragged, distorted. Who the hell is that? Tyler whispered loudly, panic rising in his tone. Mark cocked his rifle inside his tent. Show yourself. The woods remained silent for several heartbeats. Then, help. The voice was wrong, completely wrong, like someone who had heard the word once and was trying to imitate it. Help! Tyler stepped out of his tent. Is someone hurt? He called, voice shaking. Something moved behind him, big, fast. I lunged out of my tent as a shape darted between the trees, tall, twisted, pale against the darkness. Tyler staggered backwards, falling onto the dirt. Jesus Christ! He yelled. Mark burst from his tent with the rifle raised. Get back! The thing, or person, or whatever it was, slipped behind a cluster of trees, disappearing completely as if melting into the fog. We stood frozen, listening. Silence. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time. We backed toward the fire pit until the three of us were shoulder to shoulder. Mark held the rifle up. We need to leave. Now. Tyler shook his head violently. I'm not running into the woods with that thing out there. Something clicked in the darkness. A wet popping sound, then that horrible attempt at a voice again. Hell. Ooh. Only this time, it came from several different places at once, as if multiple things were mimicking it. Mark didn't wait. He fired into the trees. The gunshot exploded through the clearing, echoing through the woods. Something let out a long, high whistle. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Run! I shouted. We sprinted through the clearing toward the truck, but the fog made everything unfamiliar. Trees seemed too close. The ground felt uneven, like the forest was shifting beneath us. We lost the path. Mark's flashlight flickered uselessly against the fog. Where the hell? A figure darted across the beam, impossibly fast. I heard Mark scream. Not shout, scream. Raw fear. Something slammed into me from the side, sending me tumbling through the weeds. My head cracked against something hard, and for a moment everything spun. I heard Mark firing again and again, heard Tyler yelling for us to stick together. I pushed myself up, vision swimming, and froze. Something tall and thin stood about 20 feet away. Its limbs were grotesquely long, its skin pale and stretched tight like it barely fit its frame. Its head tilted unnaturally far to one side, as if it were studying me. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were dark and too wide. Then it opened its mouth. The whistle came from inside it. I scrambled backwards, tripping over roots and rocks. The thing took a step toward me, its joints bending wrong, as like it had learned to walk by watching something do it poorly. Then a gunshot cracked behind me. The creature vanished into the fog. Mark grabbed my arm. "Move, damn it!" We ran, shouting for Tyler. No answer. "Tyler!" Mark yelled again, voice cracking. Nothing. We stumbled through the trees until we suddenly burst onto the gravel road, the same one we'd driven in on. I don't know how we found it. Maybe dumb luck. Maybe something else drove us toward it. We didn't stop running. We reached the truck, dove inside, and Mark slammed the doors shut. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so hard I dropped them twice. As I finally jammed them into the ignition, something whistled directly behind the truck. Close. Too close. Mark pointed his rifle at the rear window. "Go, go, go!" I floored the gas. The truck fishtailed on the loose gravel, skidding around the bend. For a split second, the headlights illuminated something tall standing in the road behind us, something that folded backward into the trees with unnatural speed. We didn't speak for the entire drive back to town. Only when we reached a gas station 20 miles away did Mark finally say, "Tyler?" I slammed the brakes and pulled over. We called the sheriff. We told him Tyler got lost, that we'd heard animals, that we'd gotten spooked. We didn't mention the voice, or the creature, or the whistling. They organized a search party. They didn't find him. What they did find were our tents, shredded, not torn from animals, not cut with knives, shredded like something had pulled them apart with long fingers. They found Tyler's phone near a tree, screen cracked as if it had been dropped mid-run. They found footprints, human, bare, leading away from the campsite, then stopping suddenly, like the person walking them had been lifted into the air. A few weeks later, Uncle Terry visited me. He sat at my kitchen table, listening quietly as I told him everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't question. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh. "It's older than the forest," he said softly. "Older than the tribes who lived here. They stayed away from Lost Fork. Everyone did. The reports go back to the early 1900s. People disappearing, tents moved, voices in the dark, things in the fog, but nothing anyone could prove." He looked at me with tired eyes. "You survived because it wanted you to." I swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Even now, sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world has gone still, I hear it. A long, rising whistle. Faint, far away, growing closer. And I know it's not finished with me. Story, the end.